Hello everyone, welcome. My name is Silva Lindner. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Information, also affiliated faculty with the Center for Chinese Studies. And I wish you all a warm welcome to our occasional lecture series. Today we'll have the big pleasure of Marian O'Donnell presenting for us. But before I introduce Marian, I have a couple of announcements to make. So the next presentation in the LRCC Noon Lecture Series will be given by Greet Vangerbergen. She's Associate Professor in the Department of History and Classical Studies at McGill University. And she will be speaking on an act of imperial generosity, remaking the social order in 1st century BCE China. We've also added another Noon Lecture Series presentation on Tuesday, April 18th. Dr. Huang Haiyan, Director and Senior Curator of Guangdong Folks Art Museum, Canton, China, will be speaking on Golden Age, Canton arts and crafts in the context of East-West cultural interaction during the 18th to early mid-19th century. And then on April 6th to 8th, 2 conferences and a symposium will be taking place. So the Department of the History of Art will present a lecture, workshop and symposium on the historical art of Song China. So there's a flyer today for more information. And then the LRCCS annual conference series will present Dancing East Asia, Critical Choreographies and their Corporal Polities. The conference will take place in the Hatcher Graduate Library Gallery space. And then the Africa-China conference will be held in the Hatcher Graduate Library on April 6th and in the Henderson Room of the Michigan League on April 7th. And more information can also be found on the flyers over there. So on that note, we would appreciate if you could all turn off your cell phones before the talk begins. And I now have the great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Marian O'Donnell. This is an extra big pleasure for me. I met Marian many years ago in Shenzhen when I was starting out my own field work on maker and manufacturing culture. And Marian O'Donnell has been for me an amazing partner and collaborator and really mentor and role model in learning from and with Shenzhen. So I'm really honored to have her here today. So Marian today will be talking about and drawing from her long-term research engagement with Shenzhen. She is an independent artist-ethnographer and co-founder of the Handshake 302 art space in Baishizhou, Shenzhen's most iconic urban village. Her blog, Shenzhen Noted, formerly Shenzhen Fieldnotes, has chronicled the city's transformation through photography, notes, translation, and occasional essays since 2005. As an independent public intellectual, O'Donnell contributes to projects that make legible the scale, history, and theoretical implications of urbanization in Shenzhen. As a curator, she develops projects that redefine urban possibility through creative engagement with informal urbanization. Today, she will be speaking on the Shenzhen condition and anthropology of the intercultural. And I see the title might have changed, but please join me in welcoming Marian.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. If you can y'all in the back hear me? Okay, good. I'm mic'd. I don't have a loud voice, so if you can't hear me, please raise your hand and I'll adjust. I'd like to thank Sylvia, I'd like to thank Irina, and I'd like to thank Robert for bringing me here because it's a really great chance. It's my first time in Ann Arbor. It's the first time I actually got out of the Detroit airport and went somewhere. So it's very exciting to be here. It's exciting to have new people to talk with and also to have old friends. There's several friends from Shenzhen who are here and several friends from China Studies who are also here. And so new, old, blue, borrowed. And yes, gender is important. So what I'm going to talk about today is the first Chinese city without villages, remaking the local in Shenzhen. And there is theoretical underpinnings to all of this. If after the talk, if you're interested in who I'm borrowing from, we can unpack that. But because there's a lot of historical information that I'd like to get out there, I'm going to be kind of sketchy with the theory and put more time into the stories. So there we go. There's Shenzhen's oral history is Lingnan. And this is, of course, based on G. William Skinner's area studies map of the macro regions in China, what we think of as Han China. And so this is Yungui, the upper Yangtze, the middle Yangtze, the southeast coast, the lower Yangtze, North China, northwest China, and Dongbei. And Lingnan, of course, is down here. And so 2,000 years ago, Guangzhou is established, of course, as the most important city. And what's really important in thinking about the delta is that the way sediment flows means that the western coast is going to be more fertile than the eastern coast, which has the deep harbors. And this is going to have really important consequences for settlement. So this is the little PRD, this is the delta. And what we see looking at this map is basically Foshan, Jiangmen, Zhongshan, this area over here. This is where the really fertile rice paddies are and the rice polders. And so the history of the Jiwei, which would be, in Cantonese, I believe it's Gaiwei, is this area where basically you take the sediment that flows out with the Pearl River and you build polders, and those dikes first for salt, then for different kinds of fish. But basically the delta moves out from the western coast kind of in, a kind of reclaiming of the delta as a way of colonizing space. And this is very important because what it means in Lingnan, in the delta, the idea of Bandi, the idea of the local, is tied to access to land and to water. So that throughout Guangdong, whenever we are talking about Bandi, whether it's in Caozhou or in Huizhou, Shenzhen, Foshan, Guangzhou, Jiangmen, Zhongshan, Bandi, it's not only associated with Guangfu Hua, right, Guangdong Hua, it's also associated with village settlements that are both land and water. And so if we're thinking about how it works, and I have technology, that what you're going to see is with the settlement is these border regions where you've got land and access to water. And throughout Guangdong, it's called Hai, which is ocean, right? These are the settlements of the Bandi. And so that when we think of the local in a traditional in conditional Lingnan context, we are talking about this amphibian culture where you have land that is going to be regulated through the Ming and the Qing kind of property laws, but where the ocean, the sea, is a commons. That's defined by piracy, it's defined by retreats, but by and large, the state does not intervene in Hai, in the commons. And so the Bandi in Lingnan has a really interesting double nature. On the one hand, its land is regulated through the state, but Shangao Huangdi Yuan, right? So that the emperor is far away, so there's less regulation than elsewhere in certain senses. But because they have access to Hai, they have a commons that is unregulated and which, with the advent of colonialism, is going to open up in different ways. That's the introduction. All right. So what happens when the British come in? And for those of you who may not realize this, because you may not spend as much time as I do staring at maps, if you look at all the early British maps of the area, they actually take all of the water. The current maps split Shenzhen and Dayao, like they split along Shenzhen, half for China, half for Hong Kong. But in all of the British maps, they took the entire coastline. And as early as 1899, they had tours that they were organizing into this area. And it was actually accepted as a kind of colonial logic, that British expansion into the new territories was also expansion into the land area surrounding the waterways. This right here is Nantou, which was the historic capital of Xin'an, now Bao'an County. Guangzhou is up here, and you can see in this very detailed map that what is actually mapped is water access to Guangzhou. And so the major Humen is over in here. And so that all of the real Fuyong, which is over in here, which is where is also, it can take, even today Fuyong can take 50,000 ton boats, can unload right up in here. Humen, of course, is bigger, and then up into Guangzhou. So that this coastline here is the coastline of big boats. And it's the coastline of international shipping from an early age. Whereas coming up the west coast, they just don't have the depth. It cannot support the big boats. They run ashore, but it's all of this is the really rich farmland. So there's the former capital, the former county seat, which used to be a deep bay, all these little islands. And what the British did after, in 1911, they actually finished the Chinese side of the Kowloon-Canton Railway. And this railway, this is Shenzhen Market over here, Shenzhen Xu. And as you can see, it runs parallel to the river up into Guangdong. And it basically traverses through Shenzhen, Hakka territory, and up into Dongguan and over into Guangzhou. And an important element of what the British were trying to do is to move basically what was a riparian-based society that had a commons. The Hai was a commons in which there was much more independence and entrepreneurial possibility through the water. And they want to move it over onto land and territorialize it where it can be regulated, where it can be easily controlled. And actually, if we look at how since reform and opening this kind of anticipates, basically if you want to see how is the North colonizing Guangdong, it's basically land reclamation. You take the sea that was a commons and you turn it into land. And so that this kind of it's not a closing of the commons in the sense of barricading it off. It's basically closing access to the water commons and forcing you to trade through landed spaces, which are in turn controlled basically through the state. And so you push the Bandi from this amphibious, dual kind of regulated and open interaction with space into a strictly land-regulated kind of space. And it's actually British colonialism that starts this when they move the railway this way and they start interacting on the railway rather than going through the waterways, even though the boats are still going there. Sure.
Was the British aim basically to try to move the opium into China so that all the Chinese would get addicted?
You don't need all of the Chinese people to be addicted.
Many of them at least.
You only need the important ones to be addicted. You only need the rich ones to be addicted. Poor people need to be conscious so they can work. I mean, addiction, as I understand the way it operated, it was selective addiction, right? It wasn't, because you need workers, and addicted workers aren't useful. So, and I think that as I understand the British movement, they didn't have something that China would trade for. And they were losing the balance of payments. They wanted to revert. So silver's coming in through Peru and Mexico, and the silver comes in, instead of going to Europe, it's going into China to pay for Chinese goods and Asian goods. And so what does Britain do to reverse that? They start selling opium. But in terms of just using the railway to get to sell opium? No. I mean, they wanted silk, they wanted tea, they wanted porcelain, they wanted trade goods. And they only needed the rich people to be addicted.
Where the opium was produced?
But it was produced in India. And I don't think I have this on this map. This wasn't my map. Yeah, I did actually do this map. So that this over here, this is where the opium fields were, over here. And so basically, because it's water-based, they're coming along like this into here. The Golden Triangle is over here where you have land-based opium coming in. But if you go into Nantou, the museum there actually has pictures of the opium warehouses from Mumbai as part of the opening of this story. Okay, so circa 1978, which is just when Reform and Opening is happening, and this has skipped a lot of history. We've skipped the ban from the sea, right? There was the Haijin. There was all of these things happen. But what we see is that the cultural distribution of the local in Shenzhen is this land-water-based difference. So Nantou, which is where they speak Nantou-hua, and this was the county seat, this is a Bandi kind of area. And actually, all of this area, there was only one little village here, Shekou over here. There were fishermen, but not actually Bandi. So then Guangfu, so this speaks actually, this is Guanbao Guangfu Hua, right? So it's Dongguan Guangdong Hua. There are about 21 dialects of Cantonese. One of them is the Dongguan dialect. And so Shenzhen was actually a speaker of Dongguan Cantonese. And you can see they were right here on the coastline where they have land and access to water. And this is a plains, and right through here there's a mountain range kind of going through here. So on this side of the mountains, where no access to water, it's all Hakka. So the Hakka are actually defined as guest people, but one of the defining features of them is they have no access to water. And so the Hakka have land, but they have no water. So if you come over here, this is Dapeng, and Dapeng is one of the few places where you have Hakka with access to water, because this over here is Huizhou, which is Huizhou and then Meizhou. So this is all Hakka land. But in Dapeng, there was a military installation there, and so it was actually, they spoke what's called Qianyu, which was a kind of military Creole that was spoken throughout the Ming and Qing Emperor. And so this area in here, they are considered Bandi, they are considered local because they have access to land and water, but they speak a Creole that sounds kind of something like Hakka / Sichuan Hua, kind of. And then this area in here, which is Weitou Hua, this is kind of, when we think of Shenzhen, we're basically thinking of, this is the Hong Kong New Territories and then Luohu and Futian districts. Weitou Hua is a Creole between Hakka and Dongguan Cantonese. You cannot understand it if you only speak one of the languages, I'm told. If you've watched early Zhou Runfa movies, Zhou Runfa is Zhou Runfa something Fat Zhou. I don't know how his name is romanized. Zhou Runfa, thank you. In his early movies, when he's like not the lead but the secondary bad kind of hooligan character, he often speaks Weitou Hua. And so in Hong Kong, all the hooligans speak Weitou Hua. If you want to hear it, right? And so this area is Bandi, but it's marginal Bandi. And what happens is all of the waterways, and this is all of the waterways, are actually where the fishing people live, or the Danmin. And Danmin are kind of the opposite of the Hakka. Danmin have no land rights. The Danmin have no land rights. They can go on land to sell and to trade, but they cannot build houses. And so that when we look at the organization of Shenzhen's local in 1979, what we have are basically 3 categories of people that are defined in terms of land rights. We have the Bendi, who had traditional access to land through land and water. We had the Hakka, who had access to land. And then we have the Dan, the fishing villages, and they had access to land only after 1953 with land reform. And basically, there were fishing villages all along the coastline, and the original villages, the Bendi villages, were required by the Chinese government to give the Dan land. And so basically what they gave them was wetland. And so they had to fill in their polders and build their houses in basically what were floodplains. So that the Dan, the fishing villagers they're all around the edge of Shenzhen. So that's just a basic introduction to the local. Oh, the other thing that's really important, and we'll get there in a minute, yeah. So, this is 1982. 1980, y'all know about 1979, Guangdong province elevates Bao'an County to Shenzhen municipality. 1980, the central government elevates Shenzhen municipality to the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone. 1982, they figured out they can't actually govern that much space, so they re-established Bao'an County and the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone. And so, and you can see here it says 2020. At this point, they were still arguing with Dongguan and Meizhou over land rights. And so they kept upping how much land they actually had because they hadn't yet conceded that it wasn't theirs. So in 1953, in addition to bringing the Dan on land, the county seat moves from Nantou to Shenzhen Market. And this is a first indication that the Beijing is going to be using the same strategy of landlocking Guangdong as a means for bringing the area into its control, right? And so this is the railway. You can see it's an important part of the map. And the other important part, this road right here is the G107 road that goes up to Guangzhou. And it, from here, right here, this is Wanjingdu. It crosses into Hong Kong, so that this is one of the places where goods were sold from Bao'an into Hong Kong during the Mao era. So also the railway crosses, and G107 crossed right here. And this road goes all the way to Beijing. The road, and so the main landmarks that were thought of when the SEZ starts actually doing its planning and its working, we have a landlocked approach to commerce. It's going to be through the railway and through the road in terms of transportation and shipping on land. And they start building container ports here. This is going to become Qianhai. Right, this whole, from about here all the way up to there, that's going to become the Qianhai. So they start, Shekou starts building container ports here. Yantian starts building container ports here. You notice the Chinese maps parcel the Shenzhen Wan and Dapeng Wan differently. But that's the basic kind of strategy that the state is going to be using to remake the local in Shenzhen. And what's really important are the way that these traditional land rights are going to be redeployed in the early period of reform and opening. So if y'all have studied Shenzhen, you've heard about the fishing village. This is the fishing village. This is Shenzhen River, right through here. A river runs through it. As you can see, that the kind of the space that the fishing people, the Dan, so fishing village was a Dan village. It's the literally called Yumin Cun, and it's 原来是罗湖公社的渔民大队. All right, so it's like there are about, God, there are probably about 35, 40 fishing villages in Shenzhen that were all built like this in 1953, where you got land, go back, where you got land in the polders in order to build a village. And You got land in the polders to build the village. So you can see this is still fish ponds, and these are the jiwei. When we call so wei tou hua literally means enclosure language, right? Wei tou hua, and so these were the jiwei, the basic polders. And what's really interesting in this picture, and there's a couple things that we have to think about when we're looking at this reconstruction of the local. First of all, in traditional terms, this was not Bandi. This was not local. So that the 1984 tour of Deng Xiaoping into Shenzhen, where he visits Fishing Village, and he visits Fishing Village on January 25th, and this day really matters because while he is the next day, the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Fishing, all of the connected with rural production, agrarian production ministries are meeting, right? Liang Hui had just finished. Deng Xiaoping jumps on a train, comes down to Shenzhen. The ministries start talking about how do we extend reform into the agricultural sphere, make it bigger. The day before they are to come out with their recommendations to extend reform throughout the country, Deng Xiaoping visits Fishing Village. And he says, look what reform and opening did for a village. And so that Fishing Village was, on the first instance, selected as a site to go visit as part of a larger national strategy to push reform and opening through. And so in the national discourse, Shenzhen used to be a fishing village, gets picked up. And everyone in the world thinks Shenzhen used to be a fishing village. How many of y'all thought Shenzhen used to be a fishing village? Please raise your hands. And it's once again, we are overwhelmed by the efficiency of the Ministry of Information, right? Because it is not only that Chinese people who should know better believed it, but foreigners who never trust the government on anything else actually believed this. But I think that one of the reasons that we'll see it is that this image, this was actually built in 1982. It was rebuilt. Fishing Village was one of the first 10,000 a year villages in China. They had 32 families. Each family was built a 2.5-story house on their little polder bit of property right here. That's all they had. All the houses are the same size. They all have the same square meters. And apparently, but what this does, it's not simply that Deng Xiaoping was using this to promote his version of the country. What's also really important is this looks like an origin. This image actually looks like an origin. So that when you see this picture and they say Shenzhen used to be a fishing village and they point to this, everyone says, yes, it used to be a fishing village and look at all that rural area out there. But here's the thing, it misleads with truth. This area is actually Hong Kong, and the reason it's still rural, it's because it's the frontier zone and it's still illegal to actually develop that area. So the rural area that you're looking at is Hong Kong, and this down here, this creeping edge of industrialization, this is Shenzhen. And so Deng Xiaoping's kind of trip to Fishing Village goes through all this industrialization to the border, to the suburbs of Fishing Village. And the third thing that Fishing Village actually does then is it models rural urbanization. Fishing Village is important because it gives us a coherent origin story. It's important because it's at the border between Shenzhen and Hong Kong, and so it pushes forward a state agenda. But it is also important because it is actually, from the local point of view, it's not local, it's not Bandi, but it is actually an example of successful rural urbanization. And so when, in the context of Shenzhen, this is taken as evidence that reform and opening urbanizes rural areas. And so the Fishing Village myth does really important ideological work. And you can also see how what's going to happen is all of this is going to get landfilled in. And so this river right in here, this is actually Shangbu. And Shangbu, most in the 80s and 90s, about 90% of the construction materials for building Shenzhen were shipped in from Foshan, from Jiangmen, from Zhongshan. They were actually came in on boats. And so this down here, because so up here, Huanggang is over there. There's another port over here. And you can actually see there's a boat. And these boats could actually bring in bricks. They could bring in tiles. They could bring in sand for local concrete making. And so the construction of the city actually is accomplished through the traditional riparian trade routes. And once the city is basically built, they landfill in the commons, and it's no longer possible to actually use the water to do anything else. And the other thing that's really interesting in this is most of these early houses were actually built because since the port was basically open, at night, a lot of the villagers would come in and steal bricks and whatnot and build their homes. And, you know, they were local. Okay. So the other one final point, these houses. Yumincun is a dingcun. Dingcun means that land rights go to sons. And so each of these 32 houses was actually built for male members of the village. Female members of the village get dowries. They get stock in the collective properties in the fishing industry and whatnot, but only sons and fathers received land rights. And in 1984, this land still belongs to the village because a bandi, remember, is land and water. It's not actually buildings. And one of the really important things that village urbanization is going to accomplish is it's going to transform the meaning of village from land and water into buildings, which are still owned primarily by men. So after 1992, Deng Xiaoping comes down to Shenzhen, part of the Southern Tour. And one of the things that happens is in 1992, all of the land in, oh no, I'm going the wrong way. In 1992, all of the pink space is appropriated by the state and becomes state property. It's urbanized. And what that means is then, so that all of that remains to Fishing Village are the buildings they own, not the land anymore. In 1984, Fishing Village owned the land, the buildings, and the water rights. But as of 1992, all they owned were the buildings. And what happens in 1992 within the SEZ is as land has already become urban, the focus, the site of transformation, the site of rural urbanization shifts from land to rural bodies. And so with the shift from rural land to rural bodies, because 1992 is the year migration to Shenzhen really starts. From 1992 to about 2000, which is 8 years, less than a decade, about 10 million people come to Shenzhen. Probably 20 million come, but with shuffling back and forth, 10 million actually take up residence in the city. And most of them are going to be engaged in manufacturing. So the 1990s is when Shenzhen basically is the factory of the world. And this labor is gendered, just as land and access to land rights and constructing the local had been gendered. Labor is gendered. So that, see, they're making little toy cars. Oh, just a question, how many of y'all got a Cabbage Patch doll in the early 1980s? Or tried to buy a Cabbage Patch doll? Boom boxes, Walkmans, all Shenzhen. And these are your little Hasbro.
Transformers?
No, this is earlier. These are toy cars. I forget who made the toy cars, but anyway, this is by the Kaida. And so basically in Shenzhen, line work in the 80s and 90s is primarily women. Most factories, it's 70 to 90% of the line workers are female. Some, maybe 20% of the line managers are female, but by the time you get into administration, you're looking at most of the managers are male. The higher paid jobs of being a truck driver, of constructing the city, construction work, these are all male jobs. And so what you see happening is that in terms of the means of production, the buildings, because most in the 80s and 90s, most of the factories take place in township and village factories, are owned by men because they're owned by the village. And then the workers are primarily rural women from other parts of the country. And the outer, higher paying, more independent jobs are rural men. And so basically we see that in 20 years, Shenzhen transforms the meaning of the local. We go from having access to land and water to just having access to property. And we go from having inherited land rights to having property rights or having stock options. And this actually is played out at the city level as well, because during the 90s there were all sorts of really horrific short stories that were, or confessionals that were entitled 我嫁给Shenzhen. Like, I marry myself to Shenzhen. And this was actually an important part of the ideology of being a migrant worker. So these 20 years, like these 15 years, get memorialized in two ways. The first is the kind of Shenzhen as the expression of the agency of an enlightened cadre, in this case Deng Xiaoping. And in the other case, this is the character for Chuang. And if you've read any of the Southern Tour documents, you know that the key aspect, and this is where we see movement from land to bodies, is Chuang, right? And Chuang is a man, and this should be a horse, but it's a virile man. And so that the agency, so that the kind of identified spirit of the city is the enlightened cadre, is the face of reform and opening. And then the spirit of reform and opening is this idealized, strangely primeval kind of horsey thing.
Does he have his phallus right in the middle?
Does he have what?
His phallus.
No, that's actually the back. But yeah, see, that's the building in the back, the light. Yeah, but yeah, see it there, right? Yeah, yeah. And then you can like have breaking it off fantasies. It's where my thinking goes, right? But anyway, so this entire history gets memorialized through these two moments. Now, in 2004, Shenzhen becomes the first city without villages. In 2004, all of that, I apologize. All of this space becomes incorporated into the state, becomes incorporated into Shenzhen municipality. So in 2004, these areas, what are called the outer districts, becomes part of Shenzhen municipality, and Shenzhen becomes officially the first city without villages. Of course, however, but it has hundreds of villages that were built like this. So it has urban villages that are actually historic remnants of the 80s and 90s. And in 2006, I don't have a picture of it, but you know. In 2006, there's a very important event, this time in Futian Yunongcun, because Futian's fishing village was called Yunongcun, and it's at the Huanggang checkpoint. And in 2006, the state has said they're going to claim the land and build a new village. So the village corporation is trying to build as many tall buildings as they can because they are compensated not for land, but for square meters of their buildings. So they build about 17 20-story buildings. And in 2006, the Futian district government blows them up. Boom. And says, no, no, no. So 2006 is basically the last year that villagers can continue to build more property in their areas. But their strategy actually worked. They did get a lot of compensation for the 20 stories. They didn't, the government realized it was more expensive to blow up buildings in that way than to negotiate. So what happens after 2006 is the government, the Shenzhen government, has to figure out what do we do with these remnant villages. They are incredibly wealthy. Because they control access to property, they have factories, they have independent government, they do have some level of infrastructure because the city basically brought the water lines and the electrical lines up to the borders of the villages, and then the villages themselves connected them into the grid. So they've got decent services. At least half of the city's population lives in the villages because they're cheap. And so what is a city to do, especially when they're looking at real estate development to get rich? How do you get the property back? How do you bring the property out of the village corporations into the hands of the state and regulate it? And this is, you can actually think of as the last transformation of the local in Shenzhen, is kind of taking rights to property that were inherited through this village situation and turning it into regulated real estate is the last stage of transforming the local in Shenzhen. So now you don't even have, no more land, no more property, just taxes and a 70-year lease, right? That's the last transformation of the local that we're looking at. 2007, the Shenzhen mayor comes out and says the villages are 脏乱差, right? They're dirty, they're chaotic, they're substandard, get rid of them. But no one can afford to do it. 2009, they changed the banking laws so that it becomes easy to borrow money to redevelop villages. 2010, the first major test of this was Gangxia. Gangxia is directly in front of Shenzhen's civic center. And so it had to go. And you can see right around it these really pretty, tall, big glass buildings. And this was the Gangxia urban village. And you can see it's quite urban. And figures I've heard, but these figures really are sketchy. I've heard 100,000 people were displaced during the evacuations. I do know that once a building was evacuated, they closed them up and people abandoned their pets. Because I had friends who were part of the pet retrieval, and there was this big movement to force the Chengguan to open the building so you could go rescue the cats and dogs that were abandoned and locked into the buildings. And so these Gangxia created 20 billionaires. The transfer of the property is compensated by the state, and the compensation packages are, you get so much per square meter, plus you get replacement meterage in the new development. And Gangxia, the package was incredible. It was, I think they were getting like 1.4 square meters per meter of housing that they owned, plus huge amounts of compensation per square meter of what they owned. And so there were at least 20 acknowledged billionaires that came out of this transformation of Gangxia, because most men in a village owned a building. Some owned 2, some owned 3, because then we saw with Yunongcun that people were building as many buildings as they could. And so Gangxia is this huge moment in Shenzhen where the first city without villages, this transformation of the local, which kind of, it ends in a certain sense with Gangxia, with this new model of transforming the local. So that the remnant of the local in 2004 in Shenzhen are these urbanized villages, right? So we've seen in this period of 25 years that the local is transformed into a property-based, highly dense rental property situation. And what happens with Gangxian at this 2010 moment, that last remnant of the local is demolished. And they are brought into the state, and the Shenzhen government effectively completes what is known as the double transformation, so that rural land becomes state-owned land, and rural people, or 非农户口, become 农户口, right? 农村户口, they become 非农户口的. So that the double transformation, and this is why in the 90s we go from land to bodies, and then we go from property to identity. And so that the reconstitution of the local in Shenzhen was a double process, which focused on land and bodies, and was affected through migrant labor, but also changing property laws. So this was also Gangxia, and what like all the property over here. And what you can see is basically a lot of people who came to Shenzhen before 2010, a lot of Chinese people, would complain that Shenzhen was not a city, but it was like a market town. It was a zhen. Because basically Gangxia, with its population of 100,000 more or less, because every time I ask, they're like, oh, 10万, right? It's always, it's kind of like Chinese national population, which is always 什么亿, right? So it's 13亿, 14亿. And like, it just, at some point, people start adding another e to it, and I'm never really sure what the population is. So the basic figure for relocation in a forced eviction is 100,000. That's the number that's always thrown out there, unless it's more. Or unless they're the real estate development company, in which they're like, we only moved 2 people. But you can see that Gangxia, even though it had these very urban kind of high buildings, was actually still organized as street markets, like a market town. And so up until about 2010, the majority of Shenzhen, including the SEZ, over half the population lives in the urbanized villages, and they are living in the equivalent of market towns. And basically what Shenzhen is getting rid of is this remnant market town. So Baishizhou is this is another one of these instances. Baishizhou is the last remaining old-style urbanized village in Shenzhen. In October last year, demolition of factories started. So that one of the things that's happening now, it's not only targeting the housing, they're also getting rid of the township and village-owned factories are also being removed. And so that source of rural livelihood is also being removed. This area right here, this is the Shahe Gongye-Qu. And if you spend time reading Shenzhen Gazetteers, if you read the 1985 Tequ Zhi, they mention there are 6 official industrial parks. One of them is the Shahe Gongye-Qu, and that is this area right here in Baishizhou. This area in the back, that is the OCT. It is one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Shenzhen. There is actually a wall between the 2 of them. This housing in here, this is all Baishizhou, and these are the factories that have been turned into different forms of consumption. So the building I'm standing on taking this picture actually has a yoga studio and a jiu-jitsu studio. It's not poor. We had a German artist who came to stay, and he was very upset with us because he said, I thought rural village, he thought he'd be living someplace poor. Per unit, Baishizhou is more expensive than the house I rent. It's about 1,000 RMB a square meter. But in Baishizhou, you can actually still get something that's only 12 square meters. And so you could, wait, no, it's 100 per square meter. It's 100 per square meter. So that for our space, which is 12 square meters, is 1,000 a month plus whatever. And so for 2 young people, that's 500 RMB rent in downtown Shenzhen. And there is no other city in China, and possibly the world, where you have this high level of access to infrastructure, access to water, access to electricity, 2 subway stations, a long-term bus terminal that goes anywhere in China, and buses to all over the city for what would be 1/4 the starting salary of a college graduate. So college graduates in Shenzhen start from about 4,000 to 10,000, depending on the field. 10,000 would be architecture, 4,000 would be probably graphic design. And so a lot of them have their offices over here, and their employees live over here. Over west of Baishizhou used to be Dacong. Dacong was just demolished, is now open. It was another one where how many people moved? 100,000. But this is what remains of that rural legacy. And when Baishizhou is gone, Shenzhen will have the SEZ, the area of the SEZ, will have effectively, completely transformed the local. And the villages that remain have already been standardized into the tax regulation system. Okay, yeah. Anyway, this is me. If you have WeChat and you want to follow our artwork, scan me. But yeah, so we're done. Yes?
So are there any movements to try to sort of
Preserve.
preserve the rural,
Um,
the urban village?
Yes.
Is there any resistance?
It's the kind of Aikido school of resistance. Because one of the things that's culturally very interesting in terms of resistance in China is that losing your temper makes you look really bad. And so what most public intellectuals try and do is push the conversation in another way. And so, for example, our art space is trying to call attention to how important Baishizhou is. And we try and get as many people as possible to come to Baishizhou and to report about Baishizhou. And we have a kind of slogan which is Chai de Bourgeois, which is kind of like, we're going to make it miserable to demolish this place. You may get to demolish it, but it's going to hurt. Shenzhen's Biennale, it's Architecture Biennale this year, and starting in December going to February 2018, will be held in the Nantou Gucheng, which is an urban village. It's the first time that the city has held one of its most important cultural events in an urban village. There was, I don't know how many of y'all have followed the Hubei Cun. Hubei Cun is one from, they say 500 years ago, if they're looking at their jiapu. They say 500 years ago, but if it was actually 500 years ago, then they didn't leave when they were supposed to at the Haijin, so they were probably somehow pirating. But they're right next to the Shenzhen market, Hubei Cun, and so there's a lot of overseas Chinese money post-1842 that went into rebuilding the village. There's a lot of architecture there. It's currently inhabited by Chaoshan merchants who store fish there because it's really cheap space. And it was the first instance of successfully stopping a demolition on the grounds of historic preservation. So there is a organized movement in Shenzhen that has been somewhat successful in calling attention to villages as sites of Shenzhen history. And that has allowed for intellectual intervention and attempts to transform the city in that way. In terms of the discussion about right to housing, this actually goes back to the idea of what is a village. Most Chinese people that I've spoken with do not believe that renting gives you rights to the city. So simply renting in a space for 20 years does not give you rights to that space in Shenzhen thinking, right? You have to own the property to have rights to the space. So the demolition and reconstruction, there are only three parties involved in the discussion: the village corporation and the men who own the buildings. The government kind of watches and collects taxes, and the real estate developer. And so basically the real estate developer compensates the male villagers, but no one else actually has rights to that property. In terms of general appropriation of village property, Shenzhen has some of the best, most progressive laws in the country. Shenzhen villagers actually get compensated. And they get more than and more reliably than villagers in other cities. Meizhou right now is going through a horrific kind of demolition of the Hakka compounds, where the Chengguan is basically sending in bullies to tear down and destroy traditional housing. To get no, the round ones are in Fujian. In Huizhou and Meizhou, they're square, and then they have the crescent mooned pond, which is the kind of Hakka housing you have in Shenzhen. And so one of the most important conversations many intellectuals in Shenzhen have been trying to push forward is the idea that housing is a human right, and that Shenzhen has a responsibility to provide housing for all of its people, whether or not they have hukou or don't have hukou, whether or not they have long-term residence or don't have long-term residence. And in this sense, they've been pretty successful. This idea is pretty generally accepted throughout by Shenzhen intellectuals. The question is, however, whether or not taking a subway an hour in and an hour out qualifies as acceptable housing. Because Baishizhou, you actually have free time if you live in Baishizhou, and you can ride a bike to your office. But if Baishizhou is demolished and you have to move out to Bao'an or somewhere on a subway, you're going to be spending probably at least half an hour to an hour one way to get to your job. And so when the villages are removed, the urbanized villages are removed from the center of the city, basically young workers get moved out of the city center. The factory workers have already been moved out because the factories were demolished and unmade about a decade ago. And because the people who are being affected by these changes are young college graduates, and Shenzhen is trying to promote its innovative economy, the idea that young people should have housing is generally an accepted principle in Shenzhen. The argument is really over where should that housing be. And I am part of a group that is trying to push the conversation in the direction of keep the villages, keep the villages. But there are other parts of the conversation. And it's really important to remember the Chinese government, 39% of its income in 2016 was related to real estate development. It is a rentier state. And so most of the money that the government is taking in is coming from real estate development, which means they are if they want to keep running certain programs, they need real estate development. But if they want young people to actually participate in those programs, they need convenient, efficient, cheap housing. And how do you actually make that happen is the question that the Shenzhen government is trying to look at now that it no longer has this rural alternative, right? Because for the first 30 years, basically, the villages provided a non-state alternative that allowed for certain things to happen. And that alternative no longer exists in Shenzhen, except for this kind of remnant in Baishizhou.
Thank you, Marian. I have a question specifically with regards to, whose rights to the city. So, you were, talking about the UAVB being hosted in one of the urban villages, right? So there's different actors that now come to play, and that's kind of like who has a right to the city and who gets to say that and maybe shape it and define it. And some of these actors are new kind of foreign entities that come in, and there was always an element of bringing in foreign investment through the building of Shenzhen, right? But this time around, it seems like there's, what used to be Taiwanese investment, Hong Kong investment, is now also shifting towards a kind of innovation designerly expertise from abroad. And so I'm just curious, what you think, what is happening in that, as these are the players that being incorporated in defining what counts as a right to the city? What is changing? Is that an opportunity, or what is there also a downside to that? I mean, it sounds like it's somewhat, there's an ambivalence to that, right? Because these actors might help.
Yeah, they might. Yeah, it's good for
They might
me.
not, yeah.
Cultural industry is good for me. I get paid to do cultural things. I think that there was a lot in the early years, a lot of Taiwanese and Hong Kong investment, but in terms of Chinese national understanding of itself and the purpose of Shenzhen, right, that's 一国两制. So Taiwanese and Hong Kong investment is one country, two systems. It's not actually international. Whereas the real Maoist imperative that Shenzhen did was 超英赶美, right? The idea of surpass England and catch up to the United States. This is the Maoist goal of urbanization, the goal of modernization. And so that from the idea of what how China presents itself or sees itself as a country, Taiwanese and Hong Kong investment is necessary, but really not that important, right? It's 一国两制. It's just kind of affirming a certain idea of what it means to be Chinese. And the whole idea of the return of Hong Kong, of course, was the idea of what's going to happen to Taiwan, right? The idea of modeling this return. And of course, Macau also, comes back. And now 1.4 billion people are supporting the gambling industry. And so in terms of for example, if we look at 一带一路, if we look at the One Belt, One Road policy, what we're really looking at, as I see it, A, is land reclamation of the South China Sea, so that China is occupying the South China Sea through land reclamation. They're building installations all around the island and something, and they're recolonizing what England had colonized. And so the same thing that happened in Hong Kong and at the Shenzhen border is now happening in the South China Sea through land reclamation, and you're limiting the water commons. And so the really important point, as I understand it, is actually participating in the world economy as an equal with the United States. And what's really interesting to me in this whole Cold War and post-Cold War and are we post-Cold War discourse is Westerners forget about China. Like, they forget it was actually a triangulated system. And the three-world system, which Zhou Enlai presented in 1956 in Bandung, was actually about the idea of the non-aligned states. It wasn't people who only have rice and beans to eat. It was actually non-aligned with either the United States or the Soviet Union. And so Chao In Ganmei has to be understood against that background. It's bringing China into what it understands as its correct position in the world order. And so that in this, Shenzhen is really important, because even though Shenzhen was technically never on the Maritime Sea Silk Road, it was never on the Maritime Silk Road, it actually was defined as going into the country and out into the world. And so that if we come back to this idea of the local as land and ocean, the city of Shenzhen actually has taken that role and elevated it to a state strategy. And so now the rights to land and the rights to the sea are no longer held by individual villages, but are held by the state as such. Foreigners coming in, are we helpful? you know, the thing I always remember is like, you know, the only foreigner who's actually really, in a lot of interesting ways, transformed China was Marx, and he never went. And he was important before he was ever translated, right? Kind of like the Catholics took in the Buddha, and then they realized, oh, he wasn't one of our saints, and they kind of had to kick him out again. It seems to me that foreigners are useful in Shenzhen in particular ways, but they are accepted in Shenzhen to the extent that we are useful to the state or to the interests of state actors or to the interests of local Chinese businesses. And Chinese law still makes it very difficult for foreigners to own property, to do these kinds of things. And well, I don't have it in this slideshow, but like I think very telling is this year for the New Year's, the New Year's children, right? The little boy and the little girl and gong xi fa cai kind of stuff. The little boy is holding RMB and the little girl is holding C notes. And so this is actually still the local in a traditional sense. Men are controlling land and property, right? And the women are representing the economy and the actual productive use of that, right? The women holding the dollars. And so that there is a sense in which this local is arguably still traditional, right? It's still a kind of, if we take the state to be a masculine entity which is colonizing space in a certain way, it's still male. And it shows up as this little guy holding RMB, right? Because you never see the girl holding the RMB and the guy holding the dollars. It's always the state. The politics is primary and it's male, and the economy is feminized, its labor is feminized, but it can be international. And so, do we actually help? We're helping somebody. Are we helping the people we should be helping? That seems to me a more interesting question.
Time for one quick question, I think. Do we have to clean out, or are we? One question? Okay.
Okay, this question is coming from Russian experience. On one hand, in USSR, reform was at least triggered by what was happening in China. On the other hand, it's quite clear that understanding of this economical reform and opening was like inseparable from the idea of privatization, of kind of reinforcing private property, so the state is not an owner anymore, but a subject that secures private property rights. And from you are saying about China, I got maybe it's the wrong impression. I got the impression that it's sort of almost opposite in China. Like state is becoming more and more an owner, and property rights of this former communities are being kind of appropriated by the state.
I think that's what, yeah, but I think what's important here, and part of what I didn't, because I like rushed through all these historic moments, is the local, in cities you had private property that could belong to individuals, but in villages it was always corporate policy. It was corporate ownership.
Yeah, but corporate ownership is also kind of a local ownership.
Right, it was local ownership, but it wasn't actually individuals who owned it. And so what a traditional villager could do was build a house on communal land, right? You had land use rights, but they never really owned the land. The land was owned by the collective. And in cities, you could own land and you could own the property and you could own the building. That was one of the differences between cities and rural areas. But in 1949, 90% of China was rural. 90% of China was still collectively held by these rural entities. And so the first thing that the state goes in and does is it collectivizes them, and it actually doesn't transfer land use rights. What it does is it makes the villages a bureau within the state apparatus. A bureau. A cabinet.
They have their self-government
They had their self-government.
And this government becomes a part of the state system.
Yes, it becomes part of the state. And it was considered the dual state system. And there's also really all sorts of fun things to think about in terms of nastiness of what a state can do to peasants. But
So it's not a kind of violent appropriation, it's sort of kind of harmonious integration, or not?
the violence of the revolution was, yeah, it was violent. There was a lot of violence in the Chinese Revolution. And I mean, the images, like yeah, there was violence. And, you know, the Cultural Revolution was apparently in Sichuan, you know, the military was involved and planes were flying over and bombing different sections of the Red Guards. The revolution was constantly violent. Mao believed in continuous revolution. You know, and it's like one of those things where he wasn't wrong, he just never should have been the leader.
After Deng Xiaoping did a change somehow, I mean,
But land was never really owned by individuals. It was always land use rights.
Yeah,
And so now you can own a house or a building for 70 years lease, which is the same as in Hong Kong, right? Hong Kong people don't really have land rights. They have land use rights. They lease from Hong Kong.
What happened when
I'm really sorry.
do you renew the lease?
They renew the lease. There have already been several cases of renewing the lease, and it seems to be pretty straightforward. You just pay more taxes.
So I hate to interrupt the conversation, but we'll have more opportunity to actually talk with Marianne about this. So there's a whole symposium that will start tomorrow in the morning over in North Quad, in the afternoon on North Campus on contested innovation, Shenzhen and Skolkovo. And actually some of our people here in the room come from Skolkovo, which is sort of celebrated as the Silicon Valley for Russia. Shenzhen will continue tomorrow, is now sort of touted as the Silicon Valley for hard work in China. And so I, welcome you all to join the conversations tomorrow. There have been flyers going out to the mailing list. This is organized in partnership with Robert Adams, who is sitting right here, and Arena Artist-Ethnographer, who had to leave earlier. So please come and join us tomorrow for more conversations with Marianne and the rest of our guests. And so please join me in thanking Marianne for a fantastic talk.